Bank of Canada has cut rates for the first time since March amid slowing growth. But should we expect more cuts ahead? And what will the interplay be between central bank policy and fiscal policy with a budget coming our way later in the fall? Joining us now to discuss all this, Andrew Kelvin, Managing Director and Head of Canadian and Global Rates Strategy with TD Securities. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to be here.
All right, so we had the Bank of Canada this morning. We got the cut as expected. Walk us through the decision and what really stood out for you.
I mean, it was a pretty straightforward communique. Since the time of the July Bank of Canada announcement, we have seen some deterioration in the economic outlook, specifically those two very poor jobs reports. Additionally, and I think this is crucial, and this is something that the Bank of Canada did mention in their communications, we've seen a little bit of slowing in inflation momentum. Headline inflation's around 2%, a little under 2%, same as it was in July. A lot of the headline number is still impacted artificially by the removal of consumer carbon taxes. The core metrics had been showing momentum upwards through the summer. In recent prints, we've seen signs of that momentum starting to fade. So you had inflation being a little bit less of a concern for the Bank of Canada. You had the growth outlook being a little bit more of a concern for the Bank of Canada, as per recent reports. And you have an economy that was at a neutral interest rate with slack that was growing, judging by the sharp move higher in the unemployment rate. It's a pretty clear-cut case for them to have cut rates.
All right, so we moved out of neutral. We would be, I think, as you argued, accommodative in your note. Does 25 basis points do much for this economy at this point, or are we just getting started again on a cutting cycle?
So 25 basis points in either direction in almost any context does very little. To be honest, even 50 basis points, which is our expectation for the cumulative easing relative to yesterday, I suppose, that doesn't only probably adds a couple tenths of a percentage point to GDP growth over the next year or two. These are small adjustments in monetary policy. So we will need to see either some sort of resolution of the trade dispute with the United States or some sort of fiscal support, because absent either of those two things, we probably are in an environment where the bank needs to ease quite a bit further than we expect.
Why wouldn't we get, I guess, deeper easing then? I mean, I think your expectation is that we'll get another cut in October, and then you get those two. Do you think they're going to go much deeper than that? If they're not willing to go deeper than that to aid the economy, what would be stopping them?
So there's two parts to that question, I suppose. First is they view underlying inflation as running at about 2.5%. 2.5% is not their target. Their target's 2%, but 2.5% is evidently within that sort of margin of error, that margin of tolerance, where they feel like they can provide some support to the economy from the growth side in such a way where inflation pressures are contained. Like, by their actions, they seem to believe that 2.5% underlying inflation constitutes inflation being contained. The one thing central banks never want to do is make the same mistake twice. So there is some caution within the halls of the Bank of Canada, I would imagine, just given the fact that the last policy cycle, they clearly left policy too easy for too long. You can call that hindsight. That would be, I think, partly fair, but the fact remains that they made some dovish mistakes last cycle. So they do want to be a little bit more cautious in this easing cycle, lest they let inflation run away again by overstimulating the economy. And if you let inflation run well above your target 2 times within a single mandate, you now start to put pressure on inflation expectations. And that's a risk the Bank of Canada really can't afford to take. So it calls for a bit of caution here. The other piece is we do expect to get a budget in early November.
I think November 4th is
November 4th is the date that I had in mind as well, but I'm always a little bit wary about saying dates.
I just put it in my calendar yesterday, and I'm like, can you actually get that one right? But they'd be yelling at me, am I right?
If we both think it's November 4th, I'm sure it's November 4th.
We'll make it so.
And I just trust the government on this. We do expect some fiscal stimulus in that budget. That should provide that sort of additional support, working together with monetary policy, which prevents the Bank of Canada from having to ease below 2.25%. If that fiscal stimulus is not forthcoming, or if there is more austerity on the back of it, then we will have to re-examine our view for the Bank of Canada here. If it turns out that the damage done from the trade measures currently in place, and it's not even just the tariffs that are in place in Canada, because our effective tariff rate is not as high as many of our peer countries because of USMCA exemptions outside steel, aluminum, and autos. But the uncertainty around this trade relationship with the US is also having a big impact on businesses and consumers. And if those impacts continue to grow in terms of their drag on the economy, the Bank of Canada may also, even if there's fiscal stimulus, find itself in a position where it has to ease more. As things stand, we think we have the Bank of Canada has calibrated the trade shock pretty well. We do think we will get a little bit of support from the federal government. So between those two things, we think 50 basis points will be enough. But it is a highly contingent view. There's nothing magical about 2.25.
Let's talk about your expectations, though, or your hopes, what you'd see in a federal budget. If we need now to say, okay, central bank will do its part over here, what are the fiscal policymakers going to do? What do they need to deliver on if they want from their end to start really promoting and sort of lifting up this economy?
So there's a really interesting timing mismatch between a lot of what we've heard from the federal government and what the economy needs right now. We've heard discussions around easing interprovincial trade barriers, making it easier to build large infrastructure products to boost productivity, investing more in defense. These are all good things that will boost the economy and pay dividends over time, assuming they can be implemented effectively. But these are 2027, 2028 issues. Like if you just take defense spending, there are some measures that we can take today that would be stimulative for the economy. But if we were to significantly ramp up defense spending in Canada, a lot of that just has to be imports. Like we don't have the capacity to build all these weapons ourselves in short order. So what the government needs to do is, in my view, is find some way of bridging the gap. We need a suite of short-term stimulus measures that will help support the economy in 2026. And I don't want to go overboard. No one's looking for a repeat of 2020 or 2021 or 2022. Like that's not what I'm calling for here, to be really clear. But we do need, I believe, something to help offset the drag from the changing U.S. trade relationship to help get the economy through 2026 until some of these more structural reforms the government is trying to undertake really start to provide tangible benefits to the economy.